Okay, so if anybody has any follow-up questions, ask them now before I pull up and start discussing Chapter 9, Land Use Regulations and Environmental Issues. Let's see. Can you explain the difference between question 11 and 12? Yes. Regarding 15, so if you are married, you are unable to take from your IRA. Doesn't say that. Does not say that. You said that the way to calculate capital gains was found on page 163. No, I didn't say that. I said that would be for the transfer tax calculation. And it wasn't 163. It was, let me get the page for you again. It was 363. So guys, I don't know you guys keep putting words in my mouth I never said, so stop. Can more than one person have missed it, lien on one property? Yes, many people could have a lien on a property. Number 11 was C. Can you do the math for question 5? We did it twice. There's no reason to go over it again. Brianna, I never said it was just for single people. I don't know where you guys are getting this stuff from. You're listening to yourselves talk, not to me, obviously. I thought that a person who is over 55 gets to sell one home and have a capital gains exemption. Well, you're wrong. In question 12, I answered D. Okay, you were wrong. That would be an exemption from the required law, Jose. You're using exemption as a norm, and that's illegal. You can't do that. Remember I said under certain special conditions. That's an exception, not the rule. All right, I'm sorry, guys, but you guys are not listening. You're not paying attention. You're certainly not reading. And you're certainly trying to put words in my mouth, and that's not correct. Don't do that. So I'm sorry, but I got to moderate and move on. You guys have to catch up. You guys have to pre-read, and you guys have to ask questions relative to the information being discussed. I'm sorry if you feel offended by that, but I'm catering to a good number of students here, all of whom seem to have no problem following along and sticking to the text of the information being presented. So please keep up. Moving on. Chapter 9, Land Use Regulations and Environmental Issues. This is what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the day. So at the end of our conversation this afternoon, you'll be able to accomplish the following. Number 1, distinguish between private land use controls and government powers relating to public land use controls. You should also be able to describe environmental issues and hazardous substances, especially those that are subject to federal legislation and landmark preservation. It's a big chapter, there's a lot in it, so buckle in. Here we go. Now, land use controls. When anyone purchases real estate, the rights of ownership say that whoever possesses a piece of property can do whatever they want with the property, subject to any private or public land use controls. So long as it's for a legal purpose, you can use your property for any reason whatsoever, so long as it is not subject to any certain private controls or public controls. Private controls are restrictions, deed restrictions. Public land use controls are many, and we're going to talk about them in order. First, let's talk about the private land use controls. Deed restrictions. A deed restriction is placed on private or on property by private parties. Owners, sellers, developers can put deed restrictions on the properties that they own. When they sell the property, that restriction follows with the property. And when a deed restriction is on a property, the owner, and when he turns into a seller, the seller and any future buyers are subject to those same deed restrictions. A developer can put deed restrictions. I gave you an example yesterday of a small community in Wyckoff, New Jersey, where a developer built about 25, 30 houses with a deed restriction that said all garages must be sideways facing to the side of the property. That's a private land use control put there by the developer. It could be put there by the current owner or seller of property. And if it is, then whoever owns the property is subject to that restriction, and so is everyone in the future, whoever buys that property. So if that building, if those houses were built 20, 30 years ago and people are just buying them now, the same deed restriction applies to them. It could be for a limited period of time. It could be forever. Depends on how it's written up. Deed restrictions cannot be illegal. Like you can't say, when the property is sold, you must not sell to Jewish people. That's illegal. That's discriminatory. Can't do that. You can't negate any future sales or limit any future sales based on discriminatory practices. What you could do is put conditions under which people own it that are legal, like no basketball courts allowed in the driveway of the house. Well, if that's in a deed restriction and you buy the house, you can't put a basketball backboard or a basketball court on your driveway. You got to be someplace else in the lot or you don't have one. That's simple. So the current owner of the property and anybody who buys the property after that is encumbered by this deed restriction. So your neighbor says, forget this, and puts up a basketball court on his property. Well, wait a minute. All these houses have the same deed restriction. How is he able to put up a basketball court and I'm not? That's not right. Well, guess what? If you call the town's going to say, sorry, can't help ya. Why not? He's violating a deed restriction. A deed restriction is a private property matter. It is not a public matter. Therefore, your zoning enforcement officials, police, anybody else can't do a thing about your neighbor's backboard, his basketball court. The only remedy you would have as a resident there would sue that homeowner in court. It is the only way you can enforce private deed restrictions, other than having your neighbors try to do it, or the original developer who created it do it, or any previous owner enforce it. But they're not going to come back and help you. So if you don't want to incur the cost of a court hearing, then your neighbor's going to have a basketball court in his driveway, and there's nothing you can do about it unless you sue them in court. Private deed restrictions are just that, private. They're not governed or enforced by the law, by the public law. It's a private matter. Therefore, only a court action can cure a deed restriction violation. Anybody not understand what I'm talking about as far as what is a private deed restriction? Please don't make anything up, guys, please. So Maciel and Trinidad, you guys have questions? What about a homeowners association? What about it? Ask a question I can understand. You just posed You said, what about a homeowners? What about a homeowners association? Ask me a question I can answer, guys. Come on. All right, so I guess we're not going to get any further information. Keep questions simple and straightforward. Absolutely, Charles. Can they fight the homeowner? Who is they? Can a deed restriction be changed from a new owner? Specifically, what do you mean changed? How can a deed restriction be changed from a new owner? I don't understand what the question actually is asking. What is the fine? What fine? I never saw anything about fines. She's asking if the homeowner association can enforce the deed restriction. But what home? I never even mentioned a homeowner association. So I'm assuming now that if we're talking about a home in a homeowners association, then the homeowners association could try to enforce it through fining the homeowner. That's possible. Like a condominium ownership, they can fine you for violating the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of ownership. Those are private deed restrictions. If someone violates the deed restrictions and have the reversion and house goes back to, what? Boy, wait a minute. Hold on a second. Maybe I misread that. If someone violates a deed restriction and they have the reversion and house goes back to the original owner who put in the deed restriction. Oh, well, Lisa, I understand now here. So this is a case where a deed restriction includes a reversion clause. So it's a fee determinable ownership, not a fee simple ownership. Therefore, if someone violates the condition of the deed, then if there is a reversion clause, then the original seller or owner of that property to them has to go and enforce it and demand return of the property. That would be up to them to enforce. It's a private matter still. How about those lands designated as water areas? We're talking about private property. Are you talking about a privately owned water body? And if so, then you can exclude others from using it. But I don't understand how that is applicable. Can I have what designation changed, David? What designation are you talking about? What is the financial consequence of violating a deed? Whatever if you're living in a homeowners association, it's whatever the homeowner association decides. There is no set fee. How does the neighbor know about the deed restriction? Maybe the entire neighborhood has the same restriction. If so, yes, we can move on, Luciana. And again, I'm trying to keep people informed about information, but again, I don't want to be drawn off in tangents that have nothing to do with what we're talking about. So the only way to deal with a violation of a deed restriction, besides asking the homeowner to revert his violation, is to take the homeowner to court. If there is no reversion, then yes, that's correct, Andrew. What would a court do for violating a deed restriction? Whatever the court decides. I'm not an attorney and I would never presume to know what a court would do. Okay, let's move on. Guys, again, we're every time I open up for questions and answers, you guys go off on tangents that have nothing to do with topics being discussed. So please, and I'm going to say it one more time, please keep your questions pertinent to the information you have to know to pass a test. If I open it up for questions again and I see these questions, I'm just going to ignore them. Sorry, I just have to ignore them. So let's move on. Those are private land use controls, deed restrictions. Now, there are government powers over all privately owned property. that tell you what you can and can't do with your privately owned property. They are PETE, P-E-T-E. P stands for police powers. E stands for eminent domain, T for taxation, and the last E is for escheat. Let's start off with the first one, police power. Police power is a code of behavior that must be adhered to by all residents of a municipality. No speeding, right? No jaywalking. There's many enforcement, no illegal activities on private properties. You're burning leaves in your background. Well, in most municipalities, that's illegal and you can get fined. You just can't do anything you want with your property. If everybody had the right to do anything they wanted, we'd live in mayhem and chaos. People doing anything and everything they imaginable under the sun they wanted to do, and that's impossible to get along with. Therefore, there has to be some sort of organizational reference that we can always go to say what can and what we can't do with our properties. So police rules and regulations, code enforcement. There's also building codes and zoning ordinances we'd have to adhere to. So you want to add a deck onto your house. So you go home to Home Depot and get a bunch of supplies, and you put a brick or two down on the floor, a couple 2x4s nailed together up, and you build the deck on top of it. Well, you might not survive when that deck crashes down because it can't carry the weight that's on it. So you have to build according to whatever the municipal and state building codes require, which, number one, if you're going to be putting it on some sort of base, that base has to be a footing, and that footing has to be buried minimally 40 inches down into the ground. Why? Because it gets under what's called the frost line. Anything down to 3 feet is subject to movement. Water gets in there, it expands and contracts with the temperatures, which means the deck could be moving up and down. But if you bury the footing down below the frost line, then that deck is solid. It's not going to move. So you have to put footings in the ground. You have to be certain size. Then you have to build it on support columns, which can be no less than 4 inches by 4 inches. In some cases, it's going to be 6 by 6 or more. It's just depending on the size of the deck and the weight that it's going to carry. You can't just nail the deck into the house. It's got to be on what's called a ledger board, which is bolted through the sill plates of the house and the frame. Therefore, the deck is solidly attached to the house. So there's building codes that have to be followed to build the deck. If you don't do it right, you can get hurt. There's also building permits you have to go and get so that when you're doing construction, electrical work, or plumbing, the town inspectors can come and make sure that what you're doing is correct so that when you have your completed project, no one's going to get hurt from it. Believe me, guys, I have seen so many houses throughout the years where people just do whatever they think is necessary to build or maintain property. And I am constantly amazed that people don't die as a result of what they're doing. You have to do it according to the building codes, or else you may not get a certificate of occupancy when you want to sell. So these police powers are serious stuff. It also involves zoning ordinances. Zoning ordinances are those codes in your local ordinance book. Let's just say what you can and can't do in certain zones. Well, I'm going to build me a new pizza oven in the backyard, a wood-burning stove. That'd be great. Are you allowed to have such a structure in the area where you're going to put it, or do you have to put it somewhere else? I don't care. I'm just going to put it. No. You can't just do that. I have a neighbor who was going to put a shed in, and he put it right on the property line. And I said, hey, just so you know, you're supposed to be 3 feet away from the property line. How do you know? Well, I was 10 years on the zoning board and 6 years on the planning board, and I was 6 years an elected official. I kind of memorized the ordinance codes. So if you want, I can help you figure this out. Nope, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to leave it there. Well, that's not right. You really shouldn't do that. But I'm not going to call the cops or do anything. You do whatever you want. But you know what? Some other neighbor apparently called, and certainly the building enforcement official came over and said, you got to move your shed. Guys, there are rules that the building department has. There's zoning ordinances that the zoning department has to ensure compatibility of neighbors and properties and non-intrusiveness and open space and all kinds of rules and regulations. You just can't build or do anything you want to do with your property because you want to. Not here in New Jersey, at least. Maybe if you own 70 or 80,000 acres out there in Montana and there's no people around to look at what you're doing, you can do whatever you want. But right here in New Jersey, that's going to be tough. I always wanted to visit Montana. Big Sky State. Sounds nice. So there's building codes. There's zoning ordinances. There's health codes. In some towns, they may have a code that no more than 2 occupants per bedroom. So if you have a three-bedroom house, the most people that can live in that house is 6 people. This helps restrict an overpopulation of limited housing by people who come in and rent an apartment like for 2 bedrooms, there's 4 people, and then all of a sudden 3 weeks later there's 7 people living there. Well, the health code official would go in and say 3 people have to leave. You can't live here because there's a health code law. There's fire codes. Fire codes. On my residential structure, yeah. In my town, you have to, and by the way, in all of New Jersey, whenever you sell a house or rent it, a residential structure to a family or a person, you must have a fire official come and inspect for working carbon monoxide detectors and working smoke detectors and working portable fire extinguishers have to be in the house. And if the house doesn't have the adequate number of the right kind, you're not allowed to sell and you're not allowed to rent the apartment until you do comply. And by the way, a year ago, they changed the requirement on the CO and smoke detectors. You can no longer use the 9-volt replacement battery units. They must be 10-year sealed battery compartment units. So if you're renting property to tenants, within the last year, you must have changed over to the new CO and smoke detector regulation, or when the building inspector comes to give you your C of O, you won't get it, because it has to be according to the new type. And your portable fire extinguishers, at least one must be wall mounted in the kitchen for you to get your ability to your CO, your certificate of occupancy. If it's not, you won't get one. It's that simple. So there's building codes, zoning ordinances, police enforcement codes, health codes, fire codes. God, what else? Well, that's pretty much most of everything you're gonna have to worry about. But understand, guys, when people buy real estate, a lot of people think I can do anything I want. In reality, they can't, because these building codes and zoning ordinances, health codes, fire codes, and everything else conspire against them to do whatever they want and have to comply with the rules. So police power is a very encompassing body of law to tell people what they can and cannot do with their private property. Yes, that's the kind of rules that exist. You don't like it? You don't have to buy real estate in New Jersey. You can go somewhere else and buy real estate. But that's the rules here. The second government power is eminent domain. The right of a government entity to acquire private property for a public good. Now, eminent domain is exercised through a court process called condemnation. That's the legal process under which eminent domain is enacted. So you have a nice house and a couple acres and you're really enjoying the good life, and all of a sudden one day He's knocking on the door, and there's a guy who appears as here's a summons to appear for a hearing of public taking of your property. What? Yeah, we're putting in a light rail system in through this area, and it's right where your house is, so we're going to have to take your property from you. Does the government really have the right to take private property? Well, there's certain criteria that the government has to meet. Number one, it must be for a public good. A light rail system, kind of think of it, that's pretty much a public good, isn't it? But if they do take your property for this public good, first they must use the court process of condemnation and then give you what's called just compensation. Just compensation is based on current market values in your area. So when they take your private property for a public good, they must give you just compensation, and they do it through a court process known as condemnation. Before I move on, was there any questions about government powers or eminent domain? Is walking around naked in your backyard monitored? Here we go with the questions. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to answer that question. Does anybody else have a question I would want to answer? Please. Is there any way to deny? You can fight eminent domain, Christopher. There's a very famous court case, and I'm going to give you that right now. So I'm just going to moderate real quick. There's a very famous court case. It's called the City of New London versus Kelo, or Kelo versus the City of New London. This happened a good dozen or so years ago up in New London, Connecticut, where private property owners were told that their homes were being taken for the public good, and they were given just compensation. They didn't agree that the public good was in fact public good, so they fought the case in the local courts and laws. They take it to Connecticut Superior Court and lost. They took the court case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in a 5-4 split decision, the Chief Justices sided with New London and said, yes, it's a public taking. The public good is justified. Therefore, eminent domain can be enacted. That was a 5-4, means a split decision. It means it could have gone either way. What was the public good? Well, these homeowners, their homes were being taken so that a new pharmaceutical plant could be built on their properties. How is that in the public good? The public good would be realized through increased tax revenue generated, much more than those private property owners could muster. Therefore, the public good was the increased tax revenue to the City of New London. Now, when this court case was handed down, realtors across the country went, wow, because now you're opening the doors to someone who can come in and convince a local magistrate or someone that their project could generate much more income for the town through taxation than your measly properties generate. So Super Costco approaches your town government and says, hey, Jensen's property is perfect for a Super Costco warehouse, so we want that property. The government would say, okay, good, public taking, we generate 100 times more revenue from your taxes than Jensen does, so we'll approve the public taking. Boy, that would suck. And this is a very scary proposition. You can try to fight the eminent domain. In fact, there's one very famous person that did down in Atlantic City. And I think it was the Trump Taj Mahal that wanted to take her one family house, knock it down so they could build their Taj Mahal parking lot there. And she said no, she fought it and she won. And if you go down there, the entire casino was built around this lady's house, which is now like a 2-family or a business or something now. It's crazy. Yes, you can fight eminent domain. Very few people are successful, but you could. Was there any other questions regarding the police power eminent domain before we take a break for lunch? Just a small comment that I visited Montana, and it's beautiful. Okay, thank you. Anybody else with a question regarding these things before we shut it down for lunch, guys? Yes, you can always argue them out to just compensation. You can bring your own estimates or appraisals in and fight the just compensation and possibly get more money. Yes. Yes, Long Branch did have just a public taking. Yes. Is the just compensation based on the township or the neighborhood values? Based on the current market values in that area. They do it all over the state, guys. So basically, you do anything to the house you bought, you have to request to government, right? I'm sorry. If you're talking about making modifications to your house, yeah, you need to go down to the building department and propose what you're going to do and let them, and they'll tell you whether you need permits or not, and whether you can or can't do it, or else you need variances from the zoning department or whatever. Is gambling considered public good? That's a question well outside my pay grade, Trinidad. So I can't answer your question. All right, guys, it's noon. It's time for lunch. However, remember, if you have questions about administrative process, where to do things, how to find stuff, stay online. Don't go away and come back in 15, 20 minutes expecting them to answer your question, because you know what? They may have already answered it 3 or 4 times and are going to not respond to you. So stick online in the next minute or two. Lauren, Noel, or somebody's going to come online and answer your admin questions. And I will come back at 1 o'clock and we'll complete this chapter and be done for the day. So I'll see you at 1. So just hang in there and someone will be on in a minute.